bringing our average age down, which is good. We're going to be laughed out of here if we didn't have it.
Great. Welcome everybody to the Blue Ribbon Commission on Marijuana Policy Public Forum on Youth Education and Prevention. I'm Abdi Soltani. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Northern California and a member of the steering committee of this commission. And I'm delighted to begin this day by introducing Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom, who is the chair of the Blue Ribbon Commission.
Great. Thanks, Abby. Thank you all. Thank you to my family members. Thank you guys very much for taking the time to be here. This is the second in 3 formal forums, but we decided, you can't deny the interests of folks up in Redding and Humboldt. So we're adding that to our agenda later in the month. The next one, by the way, formally is June 3rd in Fresno. We had I thought, very successful event down in Los Angeles talking about the issues of public safety. Today we're focusing on issues related to our children, focus on education and youth and families. The June 3rd event will be targeted on the issues of actual regulatory framework for initiative and, of course, taxation. And in Humboldt and Redding, not surprisingly, pick your issue and it will be substantively addressed up there. The purpose of this commission, we established it well over a year ago, was to inform 2 stakeholders. One, those that are drafting an initiative for the taxation legalization for adults of marijuana that we anticipate will be on the 2016 ballot. But also, and I argue equally important, policymakers and the public. Whether you support the taxation and legalization of marijuana for adults or not, whether you support moving in a new direction, the likelihood that this will be on the ballot is an almost certainty. And if it indeed passes, and there's good argument that it will pass, we need to be prepared to make sure we do it in the right way. And that means elected officials, appointed officials, members of our state bureaucracy need to be focused on this, need to be participatory in expressing their point of view, their concerns, as they will be the responsible party for the application of this law. They'll be the responsible party in making sure that it's done correctly and appropriately and in the spirit to which the public believes it should be done. And so in an effort to do both, we felt it important to move through this process in a way that can achieve those twin goals. And that basically brings us to this point. We are hoping by the end of June to come out with a quote-unquote final report. We came out just a few weeks back with a progress report on this task force that includes, by the way, 21 people, many folks that vehemently oppose the legalization of marijuana, some that embrace it and support it, some that are enthusiastic and feel like we're just wasting time and we should have done this 15 or 20 years ago. A diverse group of individuals. But at the end of the day, the most important folks are the folks that were not necessarily part of those original discussions on this task force, and that's all of you. And that's why we're holding these forums. And we want to continue, and I will end, but I want to make this point. We want to continue the conversation well after today's event. We have created a platform for engagement, a safeandsmartpolicy.org, and we encourage all of you to share your point of view and to participate in a 2-way conversation before we conclude this process with our final report. I want to thank the ACLU in particular. I joked with Abby, I said, as a former mayor of San Francisco, they sued me a few dozen times, so it's nice to be sitting next to them. And I cannot impress upon you more how impressed I am about their work in this, and the diligence and the thoughtfulness. This is not an ideological endeavor. A lot of good people can disagree on this, truly. And I want to just say, with respect, while I'm an advocate for the taxation legalization of marijuana for adults and look forward to advocating for a shift in our policy, I want to make sure it's done right. And I say that as a parent, first and foremost. I've got 3 kids, and I have a wife at home that's not so convinced that we should be moving in this direction. I've got friends of ours, and we see their kids that are out there in the back parking lots. We see them doing the things that we don't necessarily want to see our kids doing. But that's the world we live in, and I'm got to recognize cards have been dealt. We can't deny the ubiquity and access to this drug. We can't deny the studies that come out over and over and over again that suggest it's easier for our kids to get marijuana than it is even alcohol. And one thing I can't reconcile is I've never met a drug dealer that has ever, and Marcia told me this, I love this example, I've never met a drug dealer that ever asked for someone's ID. And I've never met someone that was selling the drug that particularly was concerned about the labeling on the drug or the transparency about what they were selling. That's the world we're living in today. And so we have to reconcile that world. And I believe we have the opportunity to do it by strict regulatory environment and addressing those legitimate concerns that exist out there with a lot of parents and members of our community that are concerned about change, concerned about moving in a new direction. So long-windedly, again, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for the panelists. And we look forward to a robust conversation over the next hour, hour and a half.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor Newsom. I have to ask a favor. I had a copy of the agenda right here, but one of these people swiped it. Okay, I got them. Get one and I'll get one. Thank you very much. One of these people happens to be our Lieutenant Governor. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Youth Uprising and their tremendous staff for all the work that they do every day, but on top of that, for hosting us and being so gracious and taking care of everything to make today a success for everybody. So I want to thank Sikander and Vince on the facility staff, and let's give them a big hand. So thank you very much. You know, behind every project like this, there's some of us who sit at the microphone and others who do a lot of the work. And I want to thank on the Lieutenant Governor's staff, Conrad Gregory, who has put a lot of time into this project. Where's Conrad? There's Conrad, thank you. And on the ACLU staff, in particular, Alan Hopper and Will Matthews, who've been putting a lot of effort into this project from the beginning. So thank you very much. I want to just say a quick word about today's format. So there are two panels. Each panel is about 15 minutes long, and following each panel, we're going to take a little bit of time to open it up for question and answer and comments from the public. During that time, we will ask you to each to limit your comments to a minute, and I'll walk around with the microphone and try to get as many of the comments or questions. It's really not proven realistic to answer every comment or question, but everything that's coming in, we're listening, we're taking it in. In addition, as you leave, we have feedback forms where we'll invite you to just give us any written comments so that we can have the opportunity to collect those ideas more formally, and we invite your further feedback by email to info@safeandsmartpolicy.org. So we'll open it up for some comments today, but we welcome the written comment both in the feedback forms and by email. So this event is being recorded and it is being live streamed. So we did want to let you know that that's happening. And obviously, as you know, there are a lot of media here. And so anything that people say, you know, can be not only broadcast through the live stream, but also picked up by our wonderful and esteemed fourth estate, the media. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to our first panel. Our first panel is comprised of Dr. Tim Cermak, who is a co-chair of the Youth Education and Prevention Working Group of the Blue Ribbon Commission. We're joined by Brian Zaragoza, who's a youth advocate with a Pasadena-based program called Day One, which is part of a Los Angeles-wide collaborative called Rethinking Access to Marijuana. And if I could see a show of hands for those of you who've come with Brian from LA, we're really excited. This group came to our public safety forum, and we're looking forward to your further engagement in this process from Los Angeles. After Brian, we have Dr. Peter Banis, who is also a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission. So we're looking forward to you kicking us off. So Dr. Cermak, you can get us started.
Thank you. I have the honor of presenting and summarizing the report that the Youth Education and Prevention Work Group came up with. You want a microphone? Okay. That's fine. We concluded that California has the opportunity to enact new marijuana policies that better protect at-risk youth by funding meaningful support services and by reducing the problems that are created by criminal records. Our findings include the following. 1, regular or heavy marijuana use at an early age is associated with reduced educational achievement. But 2, the criminal sanctions for marijuana use have been inadequate at sufficiently reducing marijuana use by youth, while creating multiple negative impacts, especially for youth of color. And improvements are needed to make drug safety education more accurate and realistic. A tax and regulate policy has potential benefits if regulations are well designed to protect youth and strictly implemented, and if sufficient funding is devoted to services for youth, spent on services to close many of the gaps that currently exist in support for at-risk youth. School-based approaches, such as student assistance programs, in particular, have been identified as being effective in improving school retention, academic achievement, and reducing drug and alcohol use. So we conclude that universal availability of school-based services throughout California, combined with evidence-based approach to drug education, could both become a reality under a tax and regulate public health approach to marijuana policy. So why do we say that current policies have not been able to sufficiently reduce marijuana use among youth? Well, it's simple. Marijuana is readily available. 73% of 11th graders in California say it's very easy, fairly easy or very easy to obtain. And this has been consistent over the last 4 decades, despite all the enforcement that has occurred over those decades. Adolescents' perception of risk is an interesting question here, because traditionally what we've looked at is that as adolescents see the risk of marijuana use going up, their use goes down. But the data also shows that there has been no increase in the perception of risk or in the use of marijuana in those states which have passed medical marijuana laws, including California, and no increase with the relaxation of criminal sanctions. Lifetime prevalence is often looked at as a measure, but it really exaggerates the problem, because the vast majority of people who choose to use marijuana never advance to heavy or problematic use. Even heavy users are transient in their use, because the majority of heavy users tend to age out of it, and roughly only about 3 to 5% are still using daily or near daily at age 30. However, youth do undeniably have a higher rate of use and a faster rate of advancement to regular use, which is defined as 10 to 19 days a month, and heavy use, which is defined as 20 or more days of use a month. The California Healthy Kids Survey reports that 2 to 3% of California high school students are currently regular users, and another 7 to 8% are heavy users. And that results in approximately 179,000 out of the nearly 2 million California high school students who are using on an average of once every 3 days. But what makes high prevalence among a minority of young marijuana users important? Well, first, it's the developing mind and the developing brain. The brain does not finish its neurodevelopment until the mid-20s, and areas of the brain which are the last to develop are areas of the brain which are affected by the use of any cannabinoid. This results, or is at least associated strongly with educational disruption. Daily users before the age of 17 have an odds of high school completion that are 63% lower than those who have never used. Harm to education is probably the greatest risk that we need to look at with youth use. Now, research has also established multiple cognitive decrements in memory, in learning, in executive functions, which are our higher order ability to abstract and judge. And Nora Volkow from NIDA summed it up by saying, there are many students today who could be functioning at a cognitive level that is below their natural capability because of the amount of use that's involved. But science is at its frontiers. We still don't know how to tease out association from causality. And we still do not have any evidence of long-term permanent damage to the brain. The primary damage that we know is there and that lasts often for a lifetime is disruption to education. Youth at risk from marijuana often experience multiple stressors, though, including poverty, abuse, violent environments, parental drug and alcohol problems. So as a result, our efforts to prevent cannabis, marijuana use need to be part of broadly targeted strategies rather than the sole focus of a specific intervention. Since the greatest harm associated with marijuana use by youth is their education, we need to bring youth services to their place of employment, the school. We need to think through student assistance programs which are able to intervene at earlier ages and provide the education which is needed right in their place of work. And we also need to develop innovative services for those who have dropped out or who are between 18 and 21 and no longer at school. So, in summary, if a tax and regulate policy legalizing marijuana use for adults is going to be effective without harming youth, two things are required. Regulations must be developed with the primary purpose being the protection of youth in mind. And secondly, taxation. We need to make sure that sufficient funds from the taxation of marijuana are dedicated in the long run to developing the kind of school-based services which can gradually change the climate that our kids are living in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cermak. It's a tremendous feat, given the breadth of experience Dr. Cermak has, to really boil this down to that level. I'm really grateful for all of your efforts. I want to turn it now to Brian Zaragoza, who is a youth advocate from the Los Angeles County.
Hello, everyone. So I was a youth advocate during my high school days, but since I've graduated high school, I've gone on to work with J1 now as a prevention coordinator. And so as part of RAM, which stands for, Rethinking Access to Marijuana, which is a countywide work group in Los Angeles, their focus is really to prevent youth access to marijuana. And so with that said, I'd like to share about my experience with marijuana, because in high school, I went from, being that guy that would never use alcohol or weed. Excuse me. Because I was always told that it was bad and that, if I used it, I wouldn't, really do good in life. And like, if I looked at everyone else that used weed, like they were ditching and they weren't doing anything good with their lives. And so, I would never use it. But then when college started, it was a totally different experience because there was people there that were way smarter than I was, and they were using weed. And so, I couldn't understand it. Like, I went from, knowing that, believing that I knew that if I used it, I wouldn't really go far in life, to being surrounded by people that used weed and they were doing so good. They had things I didn't have. They had a car because, they had a job. They were able to get a job really early in life, like in high school, when even then they were using it. And so my perspective changed. Like, it became more acceptable. Like, it wasn't like in high school where, you knew about a few people that used weed and, you knew that they weren't going to be doing good. But in college, it was like, all right, like, they smoke, where to get it from. You knew, the guy down the hall, could get you weed if you wanted to. And so, to be honest, like, I used it. Like, I went, from the guy that would never use it to, the guy that started joining, those smoke sessions. And, it felt good. Like, I started to understand why, people would use it. And so, but I didn't know, like, about, like, the harmful effects or none of that stuff. I didn't know, like, about potency. The worst thing that I thought could happen was, I was going to smoke, I was going to get the munchies, and I wasn't going to have, any snacks around. Like, that's kind of what, was, like, the worst thing that could have happened, or at least I thought. And, I don't regret it. It was an experience that I went through, and I feel like it's put me where I'm at right now, which is working in prevention. So, working with high school students to, tell them about the consequences of marijuana use, because I stopped using because like I started thinking about not like the health risks of it, but like of the legal consequences of it. So I started thinking that I don't want to like lose everything that was going good for me, which was being able to go to a university, a 4-year university, where at first I didn't think that was a possibility for me. At first I wanted to just graduate high school and go and start working, and that was it. But I was in college, and I started learning about the possibility of losing your financial aid if you get caught in possession with marijuana. And so now in my work, when I go and talk to high school students, I let them know, like, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. Like, it's kind of up to you. No matter how many times someone tells you not to do something, you're going to eventually get curious, and whether you do it or not, that's up to you. But I tell them, like, these are the consequences. Like, a lot of things can go wrong. If you surround yourself in an environment where there are going to be other drugs, you might, if you're impaired, you might be more willing to try them out. So, that's my personal experience with use.
Thank you very much, Brian. Really appreciate the work you're doing and the work that your whole collaborative is doing. So we're now going to turn to Dr. Peter Bennis.
Thank you. Just to introduce myself, I've spent the last 35 years working in addiction with all the drugs that are abusable, and have developed 2 fellowship programs for psychiatrists and internists to study addiction for an additional 2 years of specialization. But I've gotten interested in the legal angle, a literature that I really never used to look at. Why? Because over the years, it's become clear that the war on drugs has morphed into a war on drug users. There are some aspects of the international war on drugs that are valuable. Various kinds of controls over precursor chemicals, over movement of dark money through various kinds of offshore accounts and so forth. These are valuable things. However, the low-hanging fruit has always been arrests of marijuana users. And what makes this possible, particularly in America, is that we have never embraced the distinction between hard and soft drugs, so that we have treated marijuana virtually identically to the way we treat methamphetamine and heroin. This is patently absurd. It just cannot continue. The Europeans are a bit ahead of us on this, and basically, I think, invented the modern idea of soft drugs and trying to split the markets put the market for soft drugs in a different place in a highly regulated way, and separate it out from the illegal black market for the hard drugs. This is something we've really not done here. But let's turn to the legal aspects in California around kids. We first turned marijuana possession into a misdemeanor, and then more recently we turned it into an infraction with a $100 fine. When I went into the Attorney General's data to look at what's going on, without question, the number of marijuana-related felonies and misdemeanors in youth dropped. Far more for the misdemeanors than for the felonies, which I think are mostly trafficking or intent to traffic and charges like that. What was disappointing was to find that infraction data isn't being collected in any way that's coherent. So we have an infraction era, but we can't tell you how many kids are getting infractions, $100 fine type of tickets. This is something that really needs to be done. Now, the posture that our working group has taken is that we need a system that neither criminalizes possession of small amounts nor medically pathologizes them. Possessing marijuana is not the same as being an addict. The data supports the fact that the risks to education are greater than the risks of addiction or the risks of psychosis. Marijuana is not nothing, it's not gumdrops, but the risks are fairly low. And the risk of derailing in school is, we think, rather significant if you're an early adopter, if you use early and use often. So what do we looking for? We're looking for non-criminal sanctions. You need some leverage to get kids to get help they don't want. But I don't know about you, but I don't want my kids managed by the juvenile justice system. It's not effective. It hasn't worked. Depending on how you look at the war on drugs, it's either been going on for over 40 years, or in case of marijuana, it's been going on for about 80. Has it worked? No. Is purity down? No. Is availability down? No. It's higher than ever. How about price? Have we changed price? No. Relatively speaking, it's getting cheaper. And this is true for virtually all drugs. So what to do? Well, we need to look at schools. This is the workplace of kids. Now, we've got the intrusion of the legal mind into schools as well with something called zero tolerance. Zero tolerance came out of 1990s around violence in schools, where schools were not going to tolerate violence. But that quickly morphed into being drug-free zones as well. And the data on suspensions and expulsions related to drugs is not encouraging. These kids are often lost to help. They often drop out after they're put into this kind of system. Now, California is leading by beginning to back away from some of the zero tolerance stuff around various kinds of behaviors. And I think this is really good. But we really need to rethink whether suspensions and expulsions for small amounts of drug possession are the way to go. And a number of us on the work group believe that student assistance programs are more effective and less punitive. So you'll hear us talking a lot about student assistance programs. What we need is also to ask the question of why there are about as many marijuana misdemeanors as there are for hard drugs and dangerous drugs combined. In other words, it's still low-hanging fruit. It's an easy arrest. I once sat in Sacramento with a very nice narcotics agent. I said, you know, California is underwater with the highest grade methamphetamine and heroin I've seen in my entire career. Why are you guys still busting potheads? And he looked around to make sure that none of his compadres were in the room. And he said, well, Peter, they don't shoot back. You get credit for an arrest, and you are relatively safe in doing it. Now, there are jurisdictions, particularly a project in Seattle, where the police are getting credit for sending people to treatment. This is a really good idea. You don't want to just get credit for putting people into the judicial treadmill. You'd like to get some credit for the police for sending particularly kids to something that looks like treatment. Now, the next question to ask is there treatment in the juvenile justice system? Or is that just a name? And I couldn't find it, folks. Maybe there's data there, but I just couldn't find the data to suggest that we have an effective treatment system being delivered by juvenile justice in California. There are threats, there's probation, but then you have the risks that go along with having at least a partial criminal record. You can't get a federal loan for your higher education. You can have your arrest, in many cases, as you get older, found in computer searches, which may keep you from getting a job at Walmart when they search on a computer. It can get you fired if you lie on a job application about these things. So there are lots of problems with taking an enforcement approach. And I would say the biggest problem, and we have to face it, is it hasn't worked. Whether you look at 40 years or 80 years, all of this enforcement has filled prisons, but it hasn't made a difference to purity, potency, or availability. Kids tell us that marijuana is safer than cigarettes, and they act on that by smoking more marijuana than they do cigarettes. This is just one of the realities. So we've come to a position where we're advocating for an engagement in the school system but not by having school-wide assemblies and scare them straight type of programs. You'll hear more about this from Marcia. We think we need a more systematic engagement in the kids' workplace, and that's the school system. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank all of our first group of panelists and really appreciate each of the perspectives that they're bringing. I'm going to now grab this cordless mic. So let me just see if there's somebody who would like to make a comment or ask a question. And again, I'm going to ask people to keep the comments to a minute. So I'll start here. And I'm going to hang on to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Jackie. Thank you for all your hard work and research. I've done a little study on my own, and I realized that there's not a way to make a controlled study. We have to do these associative statistics. But in my study of 3 children of color who did start using marijuana in high school, as 90% of their peers did, and who continued using marijuana throughout college, while their parents railed against alcohol and tobacco and getting caught by the man. In my study, there's 100% correlation with marijuana use, frequent, and graduating from the UC system with honors from UCLA, Berkeley, and Davis, respectively. That's my study.
Know where you're going.
I'm going to come in through a little bit. You, Derek? Okay, Derek here from Los Angeles.
Yeah, so Los Angeles youth. I feel like that the shops, you know what I'm saying, all around the community, like, should not be there. And because when I'm at the park, there's like a skate park, so all I hear is like people younger than me saying, when we going to the shop, when we going to the shop. And I'm like, how do you guys get in here, you know? But they say they have people go in there for them and bring it out, and then they buy it. So I feel like the shops should not be up. And I feel like marijuana is garbage. I say that.
So, Derek, you're referring to marijuana dispensaries in Los Angeles and young people gaining access to marijuana through adults that are going in and getting it for them. Okay, got it. Okay, if you could stand up.
Hi. My name is Aglaya Panos. I'm a pharmacist. I'm the president of the Marin County Pharmacy Association, and we've been working with a task force in Marin because there's a real drug problem, as there is in many cities. And our findings have been that, marijuana does lead to other drugs. As a pharmacist, marijuana is a drug. There are drug interactions. There's potential harm. And if we know that it affects the developing brain, there's a drop in IQ of 8 points with the use of marijuana with young people. There's a differentiation between legalization and decriminalization. We're not for putting kids behind bars or putting them in jail, but we are very concerned that marijuana is a drug. It's not the same drug that it was 30 years ago when in the 60s when I was at Berkeley and it was only 3% THC, and now it's like up to 30 and 40%. That is a very potent drug.
This issue of potency came up at the Public Safety Forum in LA as well, around how it's an evolving drug and not one that's perfectly static, so to speak.
Okay, Gilbert Mora from Southern California. Like she stated, most of your arguments are against decriminalization, which sounds good to me. But legalization is a whole nother ball of wax. As you know, increased access causes increased use. Most studies show that. So as it is now, I work in the Hollywood area. CBS has even done an expose showing how increased access has caused increased use in youth. Youth are flocking to these dispensaries right after school, waiting there. Someone goes in, buys it, sells it to them. We're not even doing it right with the medical. I'm not sure how we're going to do it right with recreation.
If you could stand up.
Hi, Sabrina Fendrick. I just wanted to make a quick comment. I'm sure you guys on the panel are familiar with this, but there's been recent research coming out of the University of Michigan that shows that teen alcohol and tobacco use are at historically low levels, lowest in the history of the study, which is 30 years old. That was done without criminalizing alcohol or tobacco. It was done with regulating it, putting it in stores, adding age restrictions, checking IDs. It's a great example to look at how alcohol and tobacco use, like I said, have been decreased by teens because of regulation and education, which I think this panel and the panelists will elaborate on, but it is a good policy to look at.
I'm going to take two more comments, and I'll take them in this row.
Robert Dusa with Oakland Unified School District. I do marijuana interventions and supervise that. I have a large concern regarding legalizing marijuana use from the drug dealer's perspective and from the students that are being brought into the trade and selling. I would recommend, I'm for the legalization and the taxation of the marijuana, but I would recommend a program inviting drug dealers to sell something else and to train them and offer them that. My concern is that they're going to continually push into the lower grade levels like they do in middle schools in our district. And my concern is that they're going to bring out stronger drugs because they want to continue to make their money and their families depend upon it. From my students that we catch selling drugs, to turn them, I'd like to have an entrepreneurial academy offered to young drug dealers to teach them how to do legitimate business enterprise. We use strengths practices. We like to find their strengths, bring it out and talk to them about that and have that conversation. And point out to them that marijuana use is actually a poor choice for mood management. There's such a long downside to it. There's better ways to meet your needs. And just identifying and meeting the needs of our young people is, I believe, what we need to do to move this forward. Thank you.
I'm going to come around to you. And Lieutenant Governor, I'm thinking in the interest of time, we'll take this comment, go into the panel, into the next panel, and then come back for more discussion.
Comments, great.
I'll
get to you.
point to this gentleman.
Bishop Ron Allen, CEO and President of the International Faith-Based Coalition. How would legalizing marijuana for recreational use just to get high absolutely help our youth from getting high? And how would legalizing marijuana for recreational use just to walk around and get high deter the black market?
You know, if there's one thing I'm taking away from this process, is just the excellence of the questions and the insights that people bring to it. So I really appreciate each of your comments. I'm going to suggest we move into the next panel. I think that we've put some interesting ideas on the table, and I think some of the subsequent comments will start to touch on some of these themes, and then we'll open it up again to further question and answer. So our second panel is really focused on prevention, education, and treatment. We're joined by Dr. Marcia Rosenbaum, who is the second of the two co-chairs of the Youth Education and Prevention Working Group of the Blue Ribbon Commission. We're joined by Sikander Iqbal, who is the Chief of Staff of Youth Uprising and previously did work in direct youth services and outreach. And we're joined by Deborah Small, who's the Executive Director of Break the Chains. And everyone's bios are in the packets. There's two other people I wanted to mention. Steve Heilig, who is a member of the commission, is here. And then I previously wanted to acknowledge Jolene Foreman, who was a fellow at the ACLU and did a lot of the work that led us up to this day. So I want to thank both of you as well. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Rosenbaum.
When it comes to drug education in America today, there is a lot of room for improvement. For the past 3 decades, from 1983 and the birth of the DARE program, which I don't have to explain to you all what it is, it's been all about abstinence, about preventing teens from using drugs in the first place. Now, that said, as a longtime researcher, as an advocate, but mostly as a mother, and now I'm happy to say as a grandmother, I believe that abstinence actually is the first choice for me, for my kids. It's the messages that are contained in abstinence-only programs that bother me, and I think they're the problem. Number one, the misinformation, the scare tactics, the exaggerations, mostly, frankly, about marijuana, are not getting us anywhere. I think our panelist, one of our first panelists, Brian, made the point really well. You hear the scare tactics, you hear the exaggerations, and that's in the classroom. And then you go into the world, and it's not quite like that. So you tend to kind of dismiss everything else that you heard in drug education. I think all of the messages are focused around one thing, and that's the old expression, which has not gone away, created by Nancy Reagan, which is just say no. All of the messages are focused around that. And they're backed up by serious consequences for kids who don't just say no, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Now, I think total abstinence, again, would be ideal. I mean, I'm a parent. That would have been really nice. But just say no actually, became sort of an antiquated joke. And that's what I'm afraid of. I don't think teenagers need any more messages. They've had messages. They see them on TV. They've had them in the classroom. They hear from their parents. All the messages and admonitions. They don't need more messages. I think, though, what they need really is real education that can actually result in keeping them safe. Imagine for a minute, if you will, that you have a sexuality education class today that doesn't mention condoms. Really? So, but that's what drug education continues to be like. And so I would propose that what they need, teenagers, is honest, science-based information so that they can make informed decisions. Much as it pains me to say it, and certainly did when my kids were teenagers, they're going to make their own decisions. This is what they do. And so, equipped with real information, I like to say, instead of just say N-O, just say K-N-O-W. Just say no. Know what's out there and believe it, and manage. So I think that's what I would go for. I think comprehensive education, which would talk about the value of going beyond the facts about particular drugs, and talk about the importance of context, moderation, self-regulation, and most of all, the value of delaying marijuana use for as long as possible, preferably until they're 21. That's what I hope drug education would do, that they believe in. I also think that drug education can no longer be a didactic exercise where you have a teacher who's lecturing to students, who often the students know more than the teacher actually does. Instead, it needs to be an interactive learning process where the students actually participate in the classes, in the groups. we simply must reject zero tolerance policies that punish offenders through expulsion and suspension. This gets us nowhere. It gets us nowhere, it gets kids nowhere. So instead of zero tolerance policies, I would propose that we look seriously at restorative justice practices that bring, instead of casting kids out when they offend, when they break the rules, bring them in, talk about what's really going on. And I believe, and my fellow committee members do, that where you get all of this, good drug education, interactive learning, and dealing with how to punish or how to restore is in student assistance programs. Peter mentioned them, I'm going to mention them too. I think they are the ideal when it comes to drug education because they do all three. They connect learning and they connect counseling and they connect referrals to the community. They are just ideal for, I think, what we need today. And I just want to tell you quickly about my very favorite student assistance program, which was actually here in Oakland, at Oakland High School several years ago, and it's called the Upfront program, and it was just a wonderful success. So, for example, evaluations of that program showed that 92% of students said that the presentations contained in that program contained useful information about marijuana. 92% said they were more aware of the risks of using alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, and other drugs. And almost 3/4 of the students who were already using alcohol, marijuana, etc., were less likely to use those drugs as a result of the presentations and participating in student assistance programs. So what happened? What happened to the Upfront program? Well, budget cuts is what happened to it. So it's gone, and this has been happening routinely across the board. So that's where I think tax and regulate comes in. I think and why the Youth Education and Prevention Committee, all of us, agreed, not without, I just want to say, we didn't start out agreeing on everything. We had plenty of arguments, right? Yes, we did. But where we came out, I think, is that what an initiative can really do to help kids is make sure that programs like student assistance programs are in every high school in California. That will actually end up doing our kids a lot of good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcia. We'll turn now to Sikander Ekbal.
You had one question, Jack? I'm sorry, you had a question?
No.
It's on now. Good morning, everybody. We want to first thank the Commission for all the work they've done and the information that they've brought forward. I think it's really helpful as we're trying to move forward in the direction that best serves not only the state of California, but thinking about the impact it has on young people. Because I think when you think about, or when we think about here, substance abuse and substance use, marijuana plays a really different role than most substances. Marijuana is a plant that you can grow, and so that changes the conversation a little bit when you're thinking about tobacco or alcohol use, or even prescription drug use. Those aren't things that people tend to grow in their backyard or in their houses, and so we know that access is not a definitive thing. Access is what young people make it. We know that use is not the problem for us. We see marijuana use as a symptom of other problems. And so it was mentioned earlier, and it's stated in the policy brief, that there are often multiple stressors that impact young people throughout their lives. And we know that the impact of things like the war on drugs have had a really adverse and devastating impact on low-income communities and communities of color. And we look at it as a way of, oftentimes for young people, a way of coping, or a way of, for them it is. For them, a lot of times it is a form of coping, or it is a form of recreation. And so I know growing up that when there's not a lot of stuff for young people to do, they start to get curious and they start to look for things to do. And a lot of times that's what it is. A lot of times it's something to do. And so for us as here at Youth Uprising, it's finding ways to engage young people in other ways, and also finding ways to talk to them about other ways to cope with a lot of the trauma that they face on a day-to-day basis growing up in communities like East Oakland. I would also like to point out the stuff that's in the policy brief where they talk about since California has legalized marijuana for medical use, other states have led the way in legalizing it for recreational use. And we have the benefit of looking at the lessons that they're learning from what they've done and how it's impacting their state, to look at that as a way to remove some of the scare tactics, as Marsha mentioned, and not be as afraid of what could potentially happen. If people feel like comparing, the lady in the audience spoke earlier about the way that education and regulation have had a positive impact on decreasing use for youth for alcohol and tobacco. And so if people aren't comfortable with using that information because they feel like it's a different drug, other states are leading the way, and I think that we should do whatever we can to learn lessons from what's going on there. And I also like to thank Robert, who earlier mentioned the impact this could have on the black market, because we know that in communities like East Oakland, there are a lot of families and communities that look to the black market as a way to make income for their families so that they could eat, so that they could pay rent, so that they could pay for the things that their families need. And a lot of times, because of the criminalization and the war on drugs, a lot of these families are almost backed into the black market and don't have a lot of other options because of the great barriers you face once you've been criminalized, once you've been labeled a felon, once you've served time in prison. And so as we're moving towards looking at the information released in the policy briefing and for the commission, it is important that we take a holistic look to say, what are all the things that we need to address to regulate or to decrease use of not only marijuana, but alcohol and cigarette usage, because people use these things not because they want to use them, but they're using them as a way to cope or as a way to deal with other issues that are going on. So that's why Youth Uprising, we've gone really far and really above and beyond our means to provide a holistic framework, a collective impact framework, even within our own building, to provide young people mental health services, providing case management, workforce development, job training, education support, credit recovery, GED. We've even provide arts and expressions. We provide acupuncture, massage, and chiropractic services once a week. And these are all things that a lot of young people don't want to try because the education's not there. So as we're also educating young people about the impact or the effects that drug use, alcohol use could have on them, we're also talking to them about and educating them about what are the ways that other services could replace those things or have a different impact on them. And we also operate within the reality that we face. If you're a marijuana user, you're not going to be able to find a job. It's going to be hard for you to find a job, and it locks you out of a lot of places. And so these are all things that we want to make sure that we're relaying to young people and helping give them the most information that we can so they can make informed decisions about how they want to exist in society, and so they can make the best decisions so they can be thriving adults. Lastly, I'd say that to Robert's point about the issues with the black market, I think this also means we need to think about the way that the legalization of marijuana for recreational use impacts reentry services. How are we supporting people as they're coming out of prison to make sure that they have other options to do, and that they're not saying, how can I manipulate these new regulations to address a market that's not being met? Because that is when you would have people saying, well, I'm going to sell to kids because they can't buy. And that's the only way I could make money because there's not a lot of other options for me. So these are all things that we need to think about so that we can make sure that we have a not just a better East Oakland or West Oakland, but we just have a better state for the children that are coming up. My children, for your children, for Lieutenant Governor's children. These are all things that we need to think about, and we're going to continue to do whatever we can to support the people in Alameda County and the young people from neighborhoods in East and West Oakland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see if this will work. Deborah Small.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm sure you can tell from my accent that I'm not a native Californian. I'm a native New Yorker, and my experience in New York, both as a parent and a drug policy reform advocate, have really informed the way that I think about this issue, both personally and professionally, and some of the things that I want to share. So I just want to start by saying that there are 3 points that I want to leave people with. One is that, prohibition doesn't protect anybody, particularly not youth. And almost anything that we do, anything that we decide to do as a state is going to put us in a better position than the one that we're in now under our current scheme. The second point is that the best way to protect youth, as has been said by many of the other panelists today, is by good, realistic education, providing meaningful activities, giving young people something to say yes to, as opposed to something to say no to, which is something that we don't talk enough about in our society. Reducing the potential involvement of young people in the criminal justice system is so much more important than protecting them from drugs, because we know about the harms that come from being involved in that system that lasts not only for their lifetime, but intergenerationally. And it seems to me that the fundamental principle should be that whatever response we have to our concerns about young people should not be more harmful than the thing that we're trying to protect them from. And then the third point that I want to make is that happy, fulfilled people don't abuse drugs. We know that. There have been so many scientific studies throughout the US and other places to show the importance of environmental factors, the ways, the context in which people are living their lives, that is the biggest influence on whether or not their drug use is going to go from use to abuse. And that's true whether or not we're talking about illicit substances or perfectly legal substances like food and alcohol and tobacco. And so, for me as a parent, it was really important to me to distinguish for my son the difference between using drugs and having drugs use you. I said to him as a teen that I definitely wanted him to delay using drugs. I also wanted him to delay having sex, not because those things were bad, but in fact because they were actually very good and very powerful. And therefore it was important to understand their power and to think about your ability to be able to manage that. I showed him people in our lives, people that we knew, people that he cared about, who had reached a point in their use of drugs that the drugs were using them. And I'm like, this is the difference between using drugs and having the drugs use you. This is the difference between being in control of your life and having something else control you. And my parenting was about creating a person who could be self-sufficient, who could go through life making responsible decisions, not just about drugs, but about his education, his employment, his sexual life, etc. And I think the best way that you do that is to actually provide good, positive examples, messages that are empowering. And I'll never forget, my son, went with me to law school, and there were a lot of people in our environment who used different drugs. It was not assumed that the fact that they used those drugs meant that they were going to be failures professionally. In fact, many of them were quite successful. So it was not actually a viable message for me to say to him that if you use drugs, your life is going to be crap, because he was surrounded by people who used drugs on a regular basis, both in my school and in my law firm, who were actually quite successful, profitable, etc. So what I wanted him to understand was, how do you have good choices in your life that work for you? And I'll never forget when he said to me in his late teens that, you know, he wasn't going to go hanging out with his friends. This was when he finally got over the thought that he was going to be a major rapper. That he wasn't going to go out and hang with them this weekend because there was a test that he was preparing for, and that he knew that in order for him to be able to be ready at his optimal to take this test, he had to keep a clear mind, which meant that he not only could not go out hanging out with his friends and drink beer or whatever, but he actually had to get sleep. He actually had to get rest. He actually had to have a body that was going to operate optimally. And I was happy that he figured that out on his own, that I didn't have to nag him to say, you've got this test coming up, what time are you coming in, what time are you going to bed, or whatever. This is, to me, what it is that we're looking to accomplish with our young people in our communities, is to provide the context and the tools that will enable them to make good decisions in their lives, regardless what things are in their environment that they're being tempted with. Because the reality, for me anyway, is that drugs have always been in poor communities. They were there in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. They were there in the 80s and 90s when I was raising my son. And I have to say that for me, I watched his generation respond to the epidemic of crack use that he was growing up around. And that generation decided on their own, not just because of what we were telling them, that this was not a drug that they wanted to use. It's really hard now for most drug researchers to find cohorts of Black youth in inner city communities that are abusing crack cocaine and heroin. And that's because they were smart enough to figure out that this doesn't work for them and to eschew it. Unfortunately, that message did not get relayed in many suburban and rural communities, and so now those young people are actually experimenting with things that they don't think are actually going to be harmful to them. And the difference is not the drugs. The difference is the mentality and the information and the context in which young people are interacting with these substances. So again, I just want to end with the three things I started with, that prohibition doesn't protect anybody. Almost anything we do will be better. And we have so many examples abroad of other countries like the Netherlands. We tend to focus on the shift in their attitude between separating soft and hard drugs. But that was also part of a broader shift that was about enabling young people to learn more about sexuality, having access to contraception, having good sex education, having good life skills education. If we cannot pretend that the only issue that young people are grappling with is drugs. There's a whole host of things that they have to deal with every day. Our goal is to empower them, or should be to empower them to deal with all of those things in a healthy way, in a way that enables them to live self-sufficient, fulfilled lives. Secondly, again, is that we have to give young people things to say yes to. So I really think it's a problem that as a state, we're having this conversation about protecting youth from using marijuana at the same time that we're cutting funding for youth activities, for recreation, for after school, for reading, for all the things that we want young people to say yes to. Personally, I'm done with the no conversation. I want us to have a yes conversation, because the more that we give young people things to say yes to, the more we have to worry about them, less we have to worry about them saying no to drugs. And the final thing, again, for those who haven't read it, I would totally recommend for people to read Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream. It really shifts the conversation that we should have about what it is that leads people to abuse drugs. Because happy, fulfilled people, people who are empowered, people who are loved, they may use drugs, but they don't abuse them. And that's true regardless of their age.
So I'm going to go first to people who didn't speak in the first round. So let me see hands for anyone who wants to comment. So we'll start here.
Hi, thank you, everyone. My name is Robert Gamboa, and I'm with the Institute for Public Strategies, and I'm also a member of RAM with Ryan, and I'm also appointed official for the City of West Hollywood. So I want to thank you, panelists. I want to put a quick vision in your head. How many of you have been to Venice Beach? All right, it's a good show. So picture Venice Beach. You got the boardwalk, and you've got the people with their dressed up in the Statue of Liberty, and they got their big money things, and they're saying, hey, go get your sample of weed over here, and or go here and get your prescription. And all this is happening, right? And we know this because we go there and we've surveyed all the kids from Santa Monica High School and Venice High School. They come and hundreds of them, and weed is the most accessible drug to them. And this is happening in a technically regulated situation right now with medical marijuana. So basically, what I want to say is increased use equals increased availability. Increased availability equals increased use. Also, increased visibility equals increased use. So it's very important that we rethink what we're doing. We can use benchmarks from the alcohol, tobacco, and the prescription drug industries, but those are some of the three most heavily regulated industries, and yet those are some of the three drugs that youth are getting access to the most. So we can take cues from them, but we really have to be smarter about what we're doing here. And I love everything the panelists had to say, but some of that smarter stuff can also be like land use restrictions, about where we put the dispensaries in the schools, density, all that kind of stuff.
And on that note, the June 3rd forum in Fresno is focused on the regulatory system, the tax system. So we wanted this session to precede that so all the learning here can flow in the design of the regulations and that thinking. Thank you. If you could stand up.
Thank you, Avi. My name is John Lee. I'm the Director of Americans for Policy Reform, and I'm also a proponent of MCLR 2016 initiative. Thank you, Avi, for your work, Lieutenant Governor, and the ACLU and the entire Commission for all your work. My question is related to what your opinion is of a specialized diversion program similar to what we've designed into MCLR 2016, where we ensure that the youth are being punished, or the ones that are being punished for marijuana offenses are not involved in the environment or put in an environment similar to hardcore drug users. Thank you.
I'm Michael Shibley. I came down from the trenches. I'm a civil rights and criminal defense attorney from Shasta County.
We're actually hosting an event in Reading in a couple of weeks.
Co-chair of the ACLU there. And what I want to bring attention to, I am pleasantly surprised by what I'm hearing today. Very, very surprised. I did not expect to hear what I'm hearing. But, and this is a big but, where I live, and in the rural counties, and in the mountains where I work, we have a different California than you have here. The criminalization of marijuana has increased. They are spending more money and focusing on the criminalization and putting people in prison still. I invite any one of you to come to Department 10 of the Shasta County Court any Monday morning and watch what you'll see. Or Department 1, where the felonies are. One after another growers are being charged with felonies. And they're growing for the same people that these people are buying from. So my question to you is, if we can't deal with the laws we have now because the law enforcement is not doing what they're supposed to do, or the California Narcotics Officers Association are training officers how to avoid the law and not follow the law, how are we going to deal with it when we have full legalization?
Did I see your hand?
Okay. How you doing? My name is Charles Porter, and I'm also from Southern California, Social Model Recovery Systems Incorporated. First of all, I just want to say great comments, and in regards to prevention, it's essential to address the social determinants and that contribute to trauma in our communities, because there's a correlation I work in the Skid Row area in LA between high marijuana usage and trauma exposure by youth, and that's something that is often overlooked. Another point I wanted to mention also, a lot of the African American youth also combine tobacco use with marijuana. They normally smoke blunts, and that doesn't come out a lot, but we see that all the time, people buying the blunt wraps and smoking marijuana and tobacco. So the decrease in tobacco usage, I don't know where that is coming from. But the point I wanted to make a comment is also the essential role that culture plays in all of this. That culture, is a strong protective factor, and just raising awareness, because I personally have done a lot of research about traditional healing and medicine amongst people of African descent. And marijuana in my research didn't come up at all. you know, and I studied with traditional healers, and they didn't use marijuana in India and China, other places, but not people of African descent. And so just understanding your culture and how these substances play a role in your culture, and addressing the social issues and what causes trauma and how we can heal our youth is very essential.
Thank you. Folks who came from LA, I'm giving them a little extra time because they drove farther. Thank you very much for all your comments, everybody.
My name is Don Carney. I work for the YMCA. I run the Marin County Youth Court. In the past 11 years, we've diverted over 1,000 kids. 90% of the cases that come before our youth court are substance-driven. We use a restorative, collaborative, not adversarial process. We're 95% successful, 8% recidivism rate after the first year. We're addressing all the concerns you put forward there without the legalization. Our probation department is deferring kids to the youth court. They succeed, no criminal record. We're in the schools diverting suspensions, taking substance cases directly from the schools, not through law enforcement, not through probation, and that's completely diverted. I think it's a little Kafkaesque to say that we need to legalize marijuana to generate revenue so we can make kids' health a priority. That's twisted.
So I'm going to hold the comments and questions. Actually, there's a person here from a youth program in our own community that I do want to give you a chance to speak. And this will be our last comment.
Thank you. My name is Anana Scott. I'm with East Oakland Youth Development Center. I'm the adult education and career coach there. I have so enjoyed this. This is so powerful and necessary. Everything that has been said up here is very purposeful and very important. What goes in our ear gates and eye gates is so very important. So what we see, what we hear, and what we experience, all of that impacts us. So whatever the messaging is that comes in our eyes, you know, the graffiti, what we see, our uncles, our papas, our wives, husbands, whoever is important to us, what we see them do, what we hear them say, and what our experience is, what is being modeled for us is so very crucial. So everything impacts everything else. So the laws that are being made, they are coming against, instead of helping us, it is hindering us. In the East Oakland and West Oakland communities, the people of color, it is a hindrance. These laws are not helping us, and we know that. Let's not pretend we don't know. So all of what we say, we've got to understand. The ear gates, the eye gates, and our experience. These laws are impacting all of that.
Thank you.
I mean, just because there were a few other hands, just briefly, if we could just, because I'd hate to have people.
Okay, if there's anyone who didn't speak in the first round?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a couple more. And I've been compiling the questions in an effort to make sure we do justice to your concerns and comments.
So this gentleman spoke in LA, but he's getting a second chance here.
Well, just specifically to what I heard up here, my name's David Bush. I'm with the 420 Law Firm. I hold myself out as a marijuana attorney. I hear education and I hear funding, and that requires a political solution more than anything. I would suggest that whatever law is written tie funding to some unique source. Dr. Saramac, it doesn't have to be tied to the sale of the actual marijuana. Perhaps a suit against 58 counties, by 58 counties against Airbnb for evading hotel taxes with part of those funds tied to education for marijuana is a political solution to the problem. I hate not having a solution. And last, I would say that making a right for children to use marijuana medically so that they have an actual right to use it for anti-seizure medication is essential to the law. That right was taken away by decisions such as Merrill and Live Oaks, and they need to have a right to that medical marijuana for that reason only, maybe.
Hi, I'm Maria Verditas from the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education at UCSF,
and the Halpern Felsher Lab at Stanford. Just a couple comments. Firstly, I think that as you guys move forward, you should consider the fact that there's a misperception that when one smokes marijuana, there is no harm to the individual or to those around them. But we know from research that comes out of UCSF that there actually is secondhand harm. So particularly for young people, that's important. If parents are smoking around their children, think that there's no negative consequences, that's a real issue. Secondly, I think, once again, with unintended consequences, we really need to think about what legalizing marijuana will do to usage of cigarettes and other tobacco products. Like somebody also mentioned, blunt use is very common. There are studies that show that people who use marijuana in adolescence transition more quickly to regular cigarette smoking and have higher levels of nicotine dependence. So as you guys move forward and you grapple with the youth use of marijuana, please also consider the youth use of cigarettes and other tobacco products. And also in terms of the way, also consider partnering with local, state, and national organizations that are messaging about tobacco and warning about tobacco products, and maybe use those relationships to create comprehensive messaging as you move forward.
Thank you. So let's
just a couple others.
Your call.
I'm pro public comment.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hi. Lieutenant Governor is now ceding some of his time, and we appreciate it.
Thanks, Gavin. Hi, I'm Ellen Comba with California Normal, and listening to these wonderful, positive, hopeful presentations, but it's still really jarred by comments that the gentleman beside me made that, youth are being recruited as drug dealers. I thought of Michelle Alexander's comment that whenever she sees someone on TV making money off marijuana, it's a white person, and whenever she sees someone arrested for marijuana, it's a person of color. And so in part of our retraining, do we have to possibly retrain the people who are recruiting youth to sell marijuana in these communities to do it in a more legitimate way? And how would we get over community barriers to that in communities that have been so hard hit by this?
Should we take one more?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, I'll reiterate, we do have the comment forms for this exact reason because time is limited. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Mickey Norris with theleafonline.com and also the Cannabis Consumers Campaign. I'd like to thank you all for the wonderful suggestions and ideas that are being put forth here. I totally support what you're offering with the social services and the schools and the honest education and the whole thing. But as we're going forward with this, I think we should not lose sight that we also, while we want to protect the youth and create safe environments for them, we also need to protect adults' rights. And as a cannabis consumer myself, I think this is a matter of equal rights and equal protection before the law that people who use alcohol safely can enjoy their rights in society. And I think people who use cannabis should also be able to have jobs and be parents and have custody of their children. And we see that their children are being taken away in these homes as well, which impacts them too. So I'd just like you to keep in mind that this is also an equal rights issue for us.
So I'm going to turn it back to the Lieutenant Governor, and in the interest of time, give him the opportunity to share a few comments, and then I don't know if we'll have time for panelist responses. Your call.
I mean, so we've got a dozen plus questions, and and some are verging off topic, but they're all relevant. I mean, there's this whole. It's interesting. Second time we've had this forum, the notion of decriminalization versus legalization. I mean, just generally, I'm curious. Anyone want to grapple with that?